Hello everyone, and welcome to the Not Null Constraint lecture. In this lecture we're going to learn a little more about null values and the not null statement. So in database theory, null is unknown or missing information. It's where you don't actually have a data point. And that's different than an empty or a zero. For example, we can ask for the email address of a person, and if we don't know, we can input a null value there. In case the person doesn't have any email address, we could have also marked it as just an empty string. And so that's kind of the difference between empty and null or a zero and null. So for example, if you have 0 sales for the month, that's different than just not knowing how many sales you have for a month. So there's a difference between that empty or that 0 value versus a null value, because the null value just means it's unknown and it's missing information, where you just have no idea if it's 100 or 0 or empty or 1,000, etc. So that's really what null stands for in database theory, the fact that you just don't know about that missing data point. So PostgreSQL provides the not null constraint to enforce a column that must not accept null values. And we've actually seen this already before. And basically what that means is that whenever you insert or update data, you must specify a value that is different from the null value. Like I mentioned, we've seen this constraint already used a few times, but let's just explore it a little more in the SQL editor. And we're going to create a quick table and see what happens when we say the not null constraint and try to add something that is a null, just to get a better and quick understanding of how it really works. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump to the SQL editor now. Okay, so here we are at the SQL editor. Let's go ahead and create a table. We're going to go ahead and say create table, and you can name the table whatever you want, just make sure it's not already in your database. We'll call this create table learn, let's just call it learn underscore null, because we're going to use it to learn null. And it's going to have just two simple columns. The first one will be some first name column. Let's say it just takes in someone's first name as a variable character string data type. And the next one, let's just say it's going to be some sales number. And we always want to make sure that we always know the sales and that we don't have any missing data points there. And what we're going to do then is put the constraint on top of it that it's not null. And so those are all columns. We close off those parentheses. Let's go ahead and run that. So again, we just said create table, learn underscore null is the name of the table, and we have two columns. A first name column, which is a variable character type string, and then we have a second column, which is a sales integer not null type string. So now let's go ahead and insert into that table. So insert into learn underscore null. And then what we're going to go ahead and do is say, let's go ahead and insert into that first name column. But notice I'm not actually going to insert into the sales column. So then we put in some values. And I want to put in my list of values. In this case, let's say this person's first name was John. And that's it. So let's think of a second before we run this what's actually going to happen. I'm going to say insert into learn null just into the first name column where values is the first name, just John. Now remember, we also had that sales column, and that had a constraint that it could not be null. Meaning if I just insert this value here, PostgreSQL is going to try to fill in the rest as null values because I'm not providing that data. It's a missing data point here. So if I actually try to run this, go ahead and run this. Notice I get an error. I get a null value in column sales violates that not null constraint. And that failing row contains, and you can see here, how PostgreSQL has filled it in as John and null. So that's how the not null constraint is going to make sure that when you're inserting values into this table as rows, if you have a null value or a missing data point, that not null constraint is going to throw up an error if you ever try to do that. So then we actually put in some sort of integer for his sales number. Let's say he sold 12. And if we run that, notice it'll say more than target columns because we need to specify up here the sales column. So now I'm going to say insert into learn null, the first name column, sales column. So I have two columns matching two values, John and 12. So if I run that, the query did return successfully. One row is affected. Let's go ahead and make sure by saying select asterisk from learn underscore null. And there it is. There's John with his 12 sales. So really the main point is understanding two things from this lecture. One is the difference between a null point in your database, so just having a null as unknown or missing information, versus the null value, how it's different than just an empty or a zero value. So that's one of the main things I want you to get out of this lecture, how null is different than just an empty or zero. Because with null, you don't know, you have missing information there. Versus an empty string or a zero, you actually have information. It just happens to be empty or zero. And then the second thing I want you to get out of this is an awareness that if you put that constraint of not null in a table, when you insert something where you have a missing data point, it will throw up an error. And that's the whole purpose of that not null constraint. So it can be incredibly useful to make sure you're not missing any information when you're trying to build some sort of larger application where users are putting in information into a table or a database somewhere. Okay, so that's it for a little more on the not null constraint. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture.